2 American warships are threading the needle through 21 miles of ocean, and Iran is trying to sink them. Missiles launched, drones in the air, small boats racing toward the hull at attack speed, Apache helicopters hammering them from above. The USS Truxtun and USS Mason did not turn back. They made it through. Both ships, both crews, every threat intercepted or destroyed. But here is what the headlines are not telling you. The 60-day deadline to legally authorize this war came and went 3 days ago. Congress went home. And the operation that was just described to the world as defensive, temporary, and focused in scope is now the most direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran that has ever happened. Who is really in control of what comes next? What you just heard is not a movie. It is May 5th, 2026, and American destroyers are fighting their way through one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet, under direct Iranian attack without a formal congressional authorization for the war that put them there. Project Freedom. That is what the Pentagon is calling it, an operation to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile choke point through which roughly 1/5 of the world's traded oil flows every single day. Iran has been using it as a weapon. Trump decided to take it back. And this morning, the shooting started. Here is what this video is going to reveal. First, what actually happened in the Strait today? The full operational picture, from the first missile to the last intercepted drone, with every confirmed detail on the record. Second, the War Powers Act time bomb, the legal clock that already expired, what Senator Lisa Murkowski is quietly building in the Senate, and why some Republicans are now breaking with the president. Third, the China factor nobody is foregrounding. Why the Iranian foreign minister is flying to Beijing this week, what that means for the Trump-Xi summit on May 14th, and how that single diplomatic visit could change the entire trajectory of this war. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. This is not a distant conflict. The gas in your tank costs $4.48 today because of what is happening in that strait. Let us start from the beginning. Project Freedom launched on May 5th, 2026. The mission? Escort American commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has been using as a pressure point, seizing ships, attacking cargo, and leveraging the world's most important oil corridor as a negotiating weapon. U.S. Central Command confirmed that 2 U.S.-flagged merchant vessels successfully transited the strait on Monday under American military protection. That is the headline the administration wants. Here is what accompanied it. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper told reporters that Iranian forces launched cruise missiles, drones, and small patrol boats at vessels under American protection as the operation began. The attacks targeted both commercial shipping and U.S. Navy ships directly. That distinction matters. This was not Iranian forces harassing tankers. This was Iran firing on American warships. The USS Truxtun and the USS Mason, 2 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, came under what officials described as a sustained barrage. They were backed by fighter aircraft and AH-64 Apache attack helicopters. The Apaches were used to eliminate 6 Iranian small boats that morning. Every threat, Admiral Cooper stated, was defeated. Neither destroyer was hit, neither commercial vessel was damaged. In a separate attack, the United Arab Emirates intercepted more than a dozen Iranian missiles launched at UAE territory on the same day. The scope of Iranian military action on May 5th extended well beyond the strait itself. Trump posted on Truth Social, confirming that a South Korean cargo ship had also been attacked during the operation, broadening the conflict's immediate victims to include a key Pacific ally. The national average gas price hit $4.483 per gallon as of Tuesday morning. That number is not an abstraction. It is the direct cost of this standoff landing on every American household. To understand why 2 American destroyers were fighting through the Strait of Hormuz on Monday morning, you have to go back through years of escalating pressure and 2 military operations that now intersect in one of the world's most dangerous waters. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a body of water. It is the single most strategic maritime choke point on the planet. At its narrowest, it is 21 miles wide. Through it flows roughly 20% of the world's daily traded oil, along with massive volumes of liquefied natural gas from Qatar. Close that strait, and you do not just hurt America. You strangle South Korea, Japan, India, and the entirety of Western Europe simultaneously. Iran has understood this leverage for decades. In the 1980s, during the tanker war, Iran and Iraq both attacked oil tankers traversing the Gulf. The United States launched Operation Earnest Will in 1987 to reflag and escort Kuwaiti tankers through exactly this kind of threat environment. And that operation, too, involved U.S. warships under fire. The parallels to Project Freedom are not accidental. In the years leading to this moment, Iran progressively weaponized the strait during its nuclear standoff with the West and its broader regional ambitions. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps became expert at gray zone harassment, seizing vessels, deploying swarms of fast attack boats, and using drones and missiles to intimidate commercial shipping without triggering a formal state of war. The U.S. launched Operation Epic Fury prior to Project Freedom as a broader military campaign against Iranian forces and capabilities. Pete Hegseth confirmed on Tuesday that Project Freedom is explicitly separate and distinct from Epic Fury. One was offensive and comprehensive. Project Freedom is framed as defensive, temporary, and focused solely on keeping commercial shipping moving. Iran did not accept that framing. Tehran called the operation's stated goal of restoring free navigation baseless, and warned that any foreign military presence in or near the strait would be treated as a threat and attacked accordingly. A senior Iranian commander made clear that U.S. forces would be targeted if they approached the strait. They approached anyway, and the shooting started. Here is what makes that background more alarming, not less, the deeper you go into it. The last time the United States ran an operation this close to this level of intensity in the Strait of Hormuz, Operation Earnest Will in 1987, it ended with a U.S. warship striking an Iranian mine, an Iranian frigate being destroyed by the U.S. Navy, and American forces sinking half of Iran's operational naval fleet in a single day. That was before Iran had the missile and drone arsenal it has assembled since, before it had proxy networks extending from Yemen to Lebanon to Iraq. If you are finding this valuable, subscribe now. We are just getting to the most important part. Every crisis of this magnitude has a cast of characters with competing interests. Understanding who they are and what they actually want is the difference between following the news and understanding what is really happening. President Donald Trump, he ordered Project Freedom, and he is the force behind its escalatory framing. His Truth Social post on Monday was not the language of a president managing a defensive operation. It was the language of someone daring Iran to provoke a bigger response. He invited South Korea to join the mission. He warned Iran it would be blown off the face of the earth if attacks on U.S. ships continued. Trump has staked enormous personal credibility on the position that American dominance in this region is non-negotiable. War Secretary Pete Hegseth, he held the Pentagon podium on Tuesday and worked hard to contain the narrative. His language was calibrated, defensive, temporary, focused. He described a red, white, and blue dome over the strait. That framing is designed to make Project Freedom look like protection rather than provocation. Hegseth is managing the gap between Trump's rhetoric and the diplomatic reality. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, He is executing the mission on the water and in the air. His Monday briefing confirmed the operational details without political spin. 6 Iranian small boats destroyed, cruise missiles and drones defeated, 2 commercial vessels through safely. Cooper is the professional soldier threading a needle between rules of engagement and an adversary that is actively shooting. Senator Lindsey Graham, he wants more, not less. He publicly called for a big, strong, and short response to further damage Iran's war machine, specifically citing Iran's attack on the UAE. Graham represents a faction of the Republican Party that sees restraint as strategic failure. Senator Lisa Murkowski, she represents the opposite instinct. She has been quietly drafting an authorization for use of military force that functions not just as authorization, but as a restraint on presidential war powers. She was prepared to introduce it when the Senate reconvened. The fact that she is doing this as a Republican is significant. It signals that bipartisan concern about the war's legal foundation is real, not just Democratic opposition. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, he called Project Freedom Project Deadlock and simultaneously announced he was flying to Beijing. That combination, dismissing the American operation publicly while pursuing Chinese diplomatic cover privately, is a precise move. He is not panicking, he is positioning. Strip away the press conferences and the Truth Social posts, and here is what May 5th actually looked like for people on the ground. 2 American merchant crews woke up Monday knowing their vessels had been tasked to transit the Strait of Hormuz under U.S. Navy escort. They made it through. That is the good news. What surrounded those transits was cruise missiles in the air, drones over the water, and small Iranian patrol boats being blown apart by Apache helicopters. These commercial sailors are not soldiers. They signed up to move cargo. On Monday, they moved through an active combat zone. The UAE took a different kind of hit. More than a dozen Iranian missiles were fired at UAE territory and infrastructure on the same day that Project Freedom launched. The UAE intercepted them. But intercepting a missile does not mean the threat is abstract. It means the air defense system worked. The UAE, a country of roughly 10 million people and one of the most prosperous economies in the Arab world, absorbed a ballistic missile barrage on a Monday morning. At gas stations across the United States, the AAA national average hit $4.483 per gallon on Tuesday. For a household driving 15,000 miles a year in an average vehicle, that number translates directly into hundreds of dollars removed from family budgets. Senator Graham acknowledged this plainly on Fox News.
I know gas prices are high, and I know we're suffering right now.
He framed it as a necessary cost. The families paying it do not get to vote on that framing. 6 Iranian sailors died when their small patrol boats were destroyed by American Apache helicopters on Monday morning. You now know what happened on the water. You know who the players are and what the ground looked like on May 5th. But there is a question this story has been circling since before Project Freedom launched. A question that the press conference at the Pentagon did not answer, and that the Truth Social posts were not designed to raise. The War Powers Act gave Congress 60 days from the start of hostilities to either authorize or halt this war. That deadline was Friday, May 2nd. Congress went home. The deadline passed. And on Monday morning, 2 American destroyers sailed into combat in the Strait anyway, under an operation that no one on Capitol Hill had formally authorized. We have been fighting a war that is now legally on a knife's edge. And that fact changes how you read everything else in this story. When the United States moves warships into a contested strait under fire, the world does not simply watch. It calculates. The most strategically significant reaction to watch right now is not Iran's. It is China's. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is scheduled to meet Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Beijing on Wednesday. This is not a routine diplomatic visit. It is happening 6 days before President Trump arrives in Beijing for a summit with President Xi Jinping on May 14th and 15th. The Iranian foreign minister is effectively briefing Beijing on Iran's position and potentially lobbying for Chinese diplomatic support or pressure before Trump arrives to sit across the table from Xi. This is geopolitical maneuvering at the highest level. China's calculus is complex. China is the largest single buyer of Iranian oil, much of which has been flowing in defiance of American sanctions for years. If the Strait of Hormuz is genuinely closed or disrupted, China's energy supply chains are among the most exposed in the world. China wants the strait open, but it also wants leverage over Washington, and Iran's diplomatic approach to Beijing before a major Trump summit gives Xi precisely that leverage. South Korea is a different story. A South Korean cargo ship was attacked during the operation, and Trump called on Seoul to join Project Freedom. South Korea's response to that invitation will be a test of American alliance management in the Pacific. Seoul is deeply reliant on Gulf energy imports transiting the strait and has enormous economic exposure to this conflict. But it also has to balance that against its relationships in the region. The UAE has already made its choice. It intercepted Iranian missiles on Monday and is described in the source reporting as a, quote, champion ally. Graham's call for U.S. strikes on Iran's war machine was explicitly framed as retribution for Iran's attack on the UAE. The UAE is not a neutral party in this conflict anymore. This segment addresses the most under-examined implication of the confirmed facts in this story, because it does not appear in most headlines, and it fundamentally changes how you interpret the political drama unfolding in Washington. Pete Hegseth stood at the Pentagon podium on Tuesday and carefully described Project Freedom as, quote, defensive in nature, focused in scope, and temporary in duration. He was emphatic that American forces would not need to, quote, enter Iranian waters or airspace. He used the word peaceful more than once. He described the operation as a, quote, gift from the United States to the world. All of that language is deliberate. It is constructed to address a specific legal and political vulnerability. The War Powers Act of 1973 requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing U.S. forces to hostilities and limits the deployment to 60 days without explicit congressional authorization. The 60-day clock started when Operation Epic Fury began. That clock expired on Friday, May 2nd. Congress did not vote. Senate Democrats voted 6 times to restrain Trump's war powers and were blocked. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he did not see desire among Republicans to act. So the deadline passed, and 2 days later, Project Freedom launched. Here is why Hegseth's careful language matters. If Project Freedom is characterized as an extension of Operation Epic Fury, the same conflict, then it is operating past the legal deadline without authorization. So the administration is arguing, through every word Hegseth chose on Tuesday, that Project Freedom is a new, distinct, defensive operation, not a continuation of the existing unauthorized war. That legal argument is untested. Senator Murkowski is preparing to test it. She is drafting what she explicitly described as both an authorization and a restraint, meaning she intends to both legitimize and limit what the president can do. That is a direct challenge to executive war-making authority from within the president's own party. The administration is fighting 2 wars simultaneously. One is in the Strait, the other is over who controls the decision to keep fighting. The legal war in Washington is not an inside baseball story. It is the story. Because if Congress acts, if Murkowski's AUMF passes with restraints attached, it changes what Trump can legally order in the Strait. It changes the rules of engagement. It potentially constrains the response to the next Iranian missile that finds a U.S. hull. And if Congress does not act, the president continues operating a war with no legal ceiling, no defined end state, and no parliamentary check, while the Iranian foreign minister sits across a table from the Chinese foreign minister in Beijing 6 days before the most consequential US-China summit in years. We are about to talk about what the scenarios analysts are gaming out, because at least one of them ends with this crisis pulling Beijing directly into it. Let us be precise about what is actually at risk here across 3 dimensions. Geopolitically, the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important maritime choke point in the world. If Iran succeeds in closing it, or even in making transit too costly for commercial shipping, the geopolitical signal is devastating. It would mean that a sanctioned, isolated, militarily weakened Iran successfully defied the United States Navy on a global shipping lane. Every American adversary in the world takes note of that. Every American ally recalculates the value of U.S. security guarantees. The stakes of Project Freedom are therefore not just about Iranian oil. They are about the credibility of American military deterrence globally. Economically, the Strait carries roughly 17 to 20 million barrels of oil per day. Extended disruption of that flow affects global oil prices within days and energy inflation within weeks. The AAA average is already at $4.48 per gallon. The International Monetary Fund has previously modeled that a full, sustained closure of the Hormuz Strait could reduce global GDP by as much as 1 percentage point, representing trillions of dollars in lost economic output. Asian economies, particularly Japan, South Korea, and China, are the most exposed. Their response to sustained energy disruption would reshape global trade dynamics in ways that American tariff policy could not offset. In terms of human cost, Iran still has ballistic missile capabilities, drone swarms, and a network of proxy forces extending from the Houthi movement in Yemen to Hezbollah in Lebanon and armed factions in Iraq. A miscalculation in the Strait, a U.S. destroyer hit, an Iranian asset destroyed in a way Tehran cannot absorb without responding, triggers a chain of actions that American military planners have spent decades trying to avoid. Lindsey Graham is calling for strikes on Iran's war machine. That is a call to escalate a conflict that is already operating without a congressional authorization past its legal deadline. The threshold between a sustained barrage that all U.S. ships survived and a catastrophic incident is measured in inches of accuracy and seconds of warning time. The Trump-Xi summit on May 14th and 15th now carries a weight it was never intended to carry. If Arachi's visit to Beijing succeeds in positioning China as a diplomatic backstop for Iran, Trump arrives in Beijing not just to discuss trade, but facing a Chinese leadership that has just been briefed by Iran's foreign minister and knows it holds leverage. Let us ground this in what the strategic community has been saying about operations like this, because the history of American naval escort missions in the Gulf provides a very specific warning. Operation Earnest Will, launched in 1987, is the closest historical parallel to Project Freedom. The United States reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers as American vessels and escorted them through the Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War. The operation worked, eventually, but it was not clean. The USS Stark was struck by Iraqi Exocet missiles in 1987, killing 37 American sailors. The USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine in 1988. The U.S. response to that mine strike, Operation Praying Mantis, resulted in the destruction of 2 Iranian oil platforms and the sinking or disabling of approximately half of Iran's operational navy in a single day. That escalatory sequence is the pattern that defense analysts point to when they assess what happens when naval escort operations meet adversarial forces who are willing to absorb punishment to impose costs. The The Congressional Research Service has documented extensively that the War Powers Act has been invoked, but rarely enforced. Presidents of both parties have consistently argued that the Act's 60-day limit does not apply to the specific conflict they are currently fighting. The distinction Hegseth drew between Project Freedom and Operation Epic Fury is precisely the kind of legal argument that CRS analysts have flagged as a persistent and unresolved tension between executive and legislative war-making authority. The Institute for the Study of War, which tracks Iranian military capabilities and doctrine, has documented Iran's strategy of calibrated escalation, deliberately attacking below the threshold that triggers overwhelming American retaliation, while imposing enough costs to force negotiation. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi's own public statement, calling for talks while describing the U.S. operation as Project Deadlock, is textbook calibrated escalation. Attack, deflect, negotiate from a position of demonstrated resilience. The question that defense analysts cannot resolve from the outside is whether Trump's escalatory rhetoric is a deliberate departure from that deterrence model or a negotiating posture designed to produce exactly the kind of Pakistan-mediated back channel that has apparently made some diplomatic progress. We open this video with a question: who is really in control of what comes next? Here is what we now know. 2 destroyers made it through. The operation is unfolding. The legal authorization that was supposed to frame it expired 3 days ago. The Iranian foreign minister is flying to Beijing, and a Republican senator is quietly building the legal instrument that could constrain a second-term president's war powers in real time. What we do not yet know is whether the Trump-Xi summit becomes the exit ramp from this conflict or the moment that locks in the next phase of it. The scenarios that come next are where this story either resolves or explodes. Best case, Pakistan brokered diplomacy, already described in the source reporting as making some progress, accelerates. The Iranian foreign minister's Beijing visit produces a Chinese diplomatic signal, perhaps a public call for restraint, that gives Tehran cover to de-escalate without appearing to capitulate. Trump arrives at the May 14th summit with Xi, and the 2 leaders use the Iran crisis as a shared agenda item, agreeing to a framework that allows Iran to step back from the Strait conflict in exchange for some economic relief. Project Freedom continues long enough to establish that the U.S. can operate in the Strait, then winds down. Gas prices begin to fall. Congress never has to vote. Likely case. The operation continues at the current level of intensity for weeks. Iran does not close the Strait fully, but maintains enough harassment to keep insurance premiums on commercial shipping elevated, energy markets nervous, and gas prices above $4.50. Congressional tension over the War Powers Act grows, but does not produce a binding resolution. Murkowski's AUMF stalls in the Senate, Democrats vote again to restrain Trump and are again blocked, and the war continues in legal limbo. The Beijing summit produces ambiguous communiques on Iran, but no binding framework. The conflict enters a grinding, expensive, strategically inconclusive phase. American military superiority holds the Strait open. Iranian proxy networks continue low-level attacks. Nothing is resolved. Everything is sustained. Worst case, a U.S. warship is hit. The political and military pressure on Trump to respond overwhelmingly becomes irresistible. Graham's call for strikes on Iran's war machine becomes policy. A broader military campaign targeting Iranian infrastructure, ports, missile sites, IRGC command nodes begins. China, freshly briefed by Araghchi and engaged in a trade negotiation with the United States, faces a choice between absorbing further American unilateralism and providing Iran with the diplomatic or economic cover that would require Washington to choose between its Iran campaign and its China trade priorities. At that point, this is no longer a straight crisis. It is a great power confrontation. We want to hear from you directly. because this story does not have a clean answer, and the people watching it are going to have to live with whatever answer it produces. First question. Pete Hegseth drew a clear line between Project Freedom and the existing war in Iran, calling it defensive, temporary, and distinct. Do you believe that framing holds, or is this the same war with a new name attached to avoid the War Powers Act deadline? There is no obvious right answer. The legal arguments on both sides are real. Second question. Senator Graham is calling for more strikes against Iran's war machine. Senator Murkowski is trying to put legal restraints on the president's war powers. Both of them are Republicans. Which instinct do you think is right? Escalate until Iran breaks, or put guardrails on a war Congress never formally authorized? Tell us in the comments. This is exactly the kind of debate that should be happening out loud, not just in Senate caucus rooms. Here are the 3 things you should carry out of this video. First, Project Freedom is not a symbolic gesture. It is a live military operation being executed under fire in disputed waters with American destroyers absorbing cruise missiles and drone barrages. The 2 ships that made it through on Monday are proof that the operation can work. They are also proof that Iran is willing to fight for the Strait, not just threaten to. Second, the War Powers Act deadline expired before this operation launched. That legal gap is not a technicality. It is the central political fault line of the coming weeks. Senator Murkowski's AUMF is the instrument to watch. If it moves, it reshapes the president's options. If it stalls, the war continues on executive authority alone, with no defined endpoint and no congressional check. Third, the Iranian foreign minister is in Beijing this week, 6 days before Trump arrives for a summit with Xi Jinping. The China dimension is not background noise. It is the variable that could either produce a diplomatic off-ramp or harden Iran's position behind Chinese diplomatic cover. Watch what comes out of the Wang Yi-Arachi meeting. It will tell you more about where this war is going than any Pentagon press conference. Watch for 3 specific developments in the coming days. First, any statement from Beijing following the Arachi-Wang Yi meeting on Wednesday. Second, Senator Murkowski's announcement when the Senate reconvenes, whether she introduces her AUMF and whether it gains Republican co-sponsors. Third, the first reports from the May 14th Trump-Xi summit on whether Iran was on the agenda and what, if anything, was agreed. This story is not over. What happens between now and May 15th could determine whether Project Freedom becomes a turning point or a trigger. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. The Strait is open today. The question is whether it stays open and at what cost.